Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're located. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Marsha Silverman, and I'm a decision sciences consultant in our commercial decision sciences team. Today, I will be walking you through our presentation here on signs that you need to adjust your model. I have a tall glass of water, a little bit boring today, but I hope you all have your cup of coffee and are ready for your sip and solve break session today. We only have 15 minutes, so let's get started and jump right in. I'm going to start, before I get into the real topic of how do you know when you need to adjust a model, I'm going to take a step back and start with what is a model. A few of you on the phone may have seen this slide before on my last Sip and Solve session about a month or two ago. Little bit of a recap, but then we'll get into some of the new information. So what is a model? It's really just an engine or mathematical formula that distinguishes the relationship between random information and event. So it's a calculation that predicts something. You all may be using models in your roles today. Some of the examples that you may know about and may be actively using are, some risk models like will an account go delinquent, or marketing models like will a prospect be responsive to a specific marketing offer, or something like a collections, who's more likely to pay delinquent debt. All those kinds of models, you're probably familiar with them in using them in your day-to-day businesses. But, how do you know if those models actually work? So there are three key metrics that we look at from an analytic perspective to identify that a model is doing what it's supposed to do, predicting what it's supposed to predict. So the three metrics that we primarily look at are the KS score, or Kolmogorov-Smirnov score, the Gini score, G-I-N-I, and the bad capture rate. I'll explain a little bit about each of these three, but really the key to these metrics is to understand that they measure how well a model is predicting what you want it to predict over not using a model. So if you don't use a model, you expect that you would get a random sample of something and you would have an equal distribution across a sample of a population as the general population. So for example, if you had a model that could select the color of a gumball coming out of a gumball machine, and you had 100 gumballs in that machine, and you had 50 reds and 50 blues, if you didn't use the model and you selected 10 gumballs, you would expect 50% to be red and 50% to be blue, or 5 and 5. But if you had a model that you could say, I only want the blue ones, you would expect that that model should give you more than 5 if you selected 10, maybe 7, 8, 9, or if you had a really good model, even 10 out of 10 would be the blue color that you're selecting the model to select. So the random line is the line denoted on this graph, on this page, that's the black diagonal straight line. And that just means you're getting the population that you would expect if you took a random sample of something. Then the models, where they are predicting, are going to provide you, if they're working, some sort of lift. And what the KS metric does is measures the distance between that random black diagonal line and the curve that is predicting your model. So the pink line vertically is the distance between random and the model, and that is your measure of KS, which goes 0 to 100, with 100 being the most predictive and 0 being equal to random. Gini is a very similar metric with looking at the curve versus the random line, but basically measures, instead of the distance, it measures the area under the curves. The bad capture rate is the third metric we look at, and that captures the number of your BADs, or your objective function, what your model is targeting in a certain percentage of the population. So if you look at the pink dotted line at your 20% of the population across the x-axis, you see that across going up, you're getting almost 48, almost 50% of your bads. So within 20, you're taking 20% of the population, you're getting 48% of the bads. So back to that gumball machine, if you took 20 gumballs out at random, you would expect 10 and 10, but now if you're using the model, you're getting quite significantly more, 48% of all of your blue gumballs coming out. So those are the metrics we look at, and we know that models deteriorate over time, and you may see some effects of that when you are using your models. You may see that if you're using a response model over time, that your response rate as you use it over time starts to diminish. So maybe you had a response rate of 1% and now it's going down to 0.8 and then 0.6. You say, well, it's deteriorating. Well, why is that happening? And you may say, well, the model's not working. But there are things that happen that can cause a model to deteriorate. We talk about one of the main assumptions of any model is that the future will be a lot like the past. So when we develop a model, we say, this is what happened in the past. Let's make a predictive model based off of that, assuming that the future will be very similar to that. However, change is always inevitable. Change is continuous. Businesses do change how they conduct business over time. So you may change a policy, and that may impact the model. And there are changes in the external factors, such as the economy, politics, regulations, etc. So therefore, scorecards will degrade over time as a byproduct of these changes. But one thing to note is that changes are gradual, so also will be the process of a model degradation. Now, as I mentioned, you may see some of the degradation occurring through rates that you're looking at. Maybe your loss rate starts to tick up as you're approving new accounts. Maybe your response rate starts to go down as you are doing new marketing campaigns. You may see it, but you may not. And the question is, how can you identify if and when a model is deteriorating and deteriorating to the point where you really may need to make some changes? So if we go on to slide 5, this is how we assess if a model is still working. So we know the metrics that we use to look at if a model is working, predicting what you want it to predict, but how do we know if it's still working? And so what we do here at Experian is we perform periodic reviews and do score validation. So what we do is say, if a model was developed, say, a couple of years ago, and we had used first quarter 2017 data to develop the model, what we would do is then say, let's take a newer sample, and on the example on this page is take a sample from first quarter 2018, so a year later. We score it at that population at that point. Then we look at, in this example, the 12-month performance window and say, what was the actual behavior through first quarter of 2019? And here I used an example of a risk model where bad being delinquencies and good being the non-delinquencies. It said, okay, based on the retro-scored population of first quarter 2018, how well did the score at that point, that observation point, predict the actual behavior over the next 12 months? And so once we do that type of validation, we can look and see how well it's performing with those same types of metric versus how it was performing before. So if we go on to the next slide, at Experian we do annual validations of every one of our scores that we have in circulation. And some of you may have seen this graph before. This comes from our annual validation of our SBCS score, one of our risk scores here. And you can see that we have at the bottom of the chart, we have PY and CY for each of the 3 metrics, KS, Gini, and bad capture rate at the 20% level, PY is prior year, and CY is current year. And on this chart, we just happen to have two of our scores, our SPCS 1 and our SPCS 2 scores. But if we look at just the KS for the blue bars, the SPCS 1 score, the KS for the prior year was 55.3, and now for the current year, when we're validating it versus last year, it actually went up to 59.33. So in this case, we happen to see better performance. So all those factors that I said can impact a model. Sometimes you see degradation, sometimes you do see improvement like we see here. This was a positive validation for us. So when we see indicators like this where the metrics are showing that models are still predictive, we know that the model is still working. If we go on to the next slide, another thing that you could say is, well, the model may be working, but I am seeing, say, a lower approval rate. I'm using the same risk score with the same cutoffs, but I'm seeing a lower approval rate. And why aren't we getting as many booked accounts and my volumes are down? So another thing that we look at here is a population stability index. So a population shift can mask the effectiveness of a model. And what I mean by that is that the model still may be working. It may be predicting what you've trained that model to predict, you know, a delinquency, a responsive account. It may still be predicting that, but your population that is running through the model may have shifted. And so what the PSI, or Population Stability Index, measures, it quantifies the shift in the score distribution for two populations. So we also look at this year over year for every one of our models. And you can see at the bottom of the page the calculation of how you look at the PSI, and then also the buckets of how we consider, these are our rules of thumb, how we consider the output, the outcome of the PSI. If it's greater than 0.25, there's a significant change in the population. If it's between 0.1 and 0.25, there's some minor changes. And a PSI less than or equal to 0.1, no significant change. So what I have seen recently with some of our clients here at Experian is they come in and say, our model is no longer working, but when we look at the results, the models have been predictive. They still rank. The metrics like KS, Gini, and bad capture rate show that the model is ranking well and it's performing well and still predicting what it's supposed to predict. But when the population shifts like that, when the population shifts significantly, it can mask the performance of the model. And I've seen that a lot recently with various clients. So something to keep in mind, that it may not be the model, it may really be just the population coming through. So once you've gone through these assessments, if we go on to the next slide, what could be done about this, right? If you see that there's a model is not performing as you wanted it to perform or as it used to perform, what can you do? And this is something that we often do here, is if we notice that there's deterioration, we may recalibrate a model. And what I mean by recalibrate is say, let's use all of the same data elements within the model, but kind of rejigger and see if there's different calculations and coefficients that can make the model stronger. Sometimes we'll do that and work with clients if they're data feeds and it's much more complicated, if you change the whole model overall, and it could be a simpler, easier fix to just change some of the coefficients or the algorithm rather than all of the inputs. But if a model has some significant deterioration, there may be need to fully redevelop, and this may be driven also by model governance. If you fall below certain thresholds of deterioration, that you may need to redevelop the whole model overall. And these are things that we offer at Experian to help with. If you see deterioration in models, we can offer some of these services to help you assess the situation and see what is going on with your models, and also look and find the solutions so that you can have a good model going forward and helping you meet your business needs. So with that, we've come to the end of our session today. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us and taking the time to take your break with us. If you have any questions or want to learn more about what I talked to today, feel free to use the link here to chat with us. Also, if you want to get notified about future sessions, make sure to join the list. We have some really exciting sessions coming up, and I hope to hear you on the line or be on the line with you in the future. And I enjoy this coffee break with you. Now back to work.